Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Middle East Institute. My name is Fanar Haddad, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ali Allawi to you today, who will be speaking to us about a new Middle East Confederation. Professor Allawi is a writer, biographer, and former Iraqi minister. He received his education at the MIT and at Harvard University. He served in the World Bank Group for a number of years before founding his own investment firm. Following the political changes in Iraq in 2003, he served as the Minister of Trade and then as the first civilian Minister of Defense. In 2005, he was elected to the Constituent Assembly of Iraq and then served as Minister of Finance. In 2007, he left public service to pursue scholarly and academic interests, much to our fortune, as he joined us at the MEI briefly. He has authored 4 books, including The Occupation of Iraq, which is an excellent reflection on Professor Allawi's time in Iraqi politics in the early years after 2003. He has also authored The Crisis of Islamic Civilization, that came out in 2009, and most recently was his book Faisal I, a biography of the first monarch of Iraq. He is the recipient of several public policy and diplomacy awards, and his books have garnered several prizes. He's currently working on another book on the economic history of the modern Arab and Islamic worlds. So without further ado, Professor Ali Allawi.
Although the topic today is a Middle Eastern or the political economy of the Middle Eastern Confederation, it is what next after the cycle of wars and insurrections and destruction that we've had. On and off, we've had it since the late 1970s with the advent of the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War and the embargo and the sanctions on Iraq following the Kuwait invasion. And then we had, of course, the most significant event, I think, in modern Middle Eastern history, which is, apart from World War I, which is the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which set loose all kinds of forces, and we're seeing the effects of them now. But we have to really see beyond the crisis, and I'm not being overly optimistic or overly pessimistic, but while we are reaching the end, inshallah, or God willing, of the conflicts in the area, that we have to really begin to think seriously about, well, what next? Are we going to re-establish the same patterns of introversion, hostility, intrastate hostility in the Middle East, irreconcilable differences, beggar thy neighbor policies, and so on, which will set the stage for another crisis, maybe decades down the line. So I'm drawing a page out of World War II, where towards the end of 1944, after the landings and D-Day, the Allies set up a high-level economic committee out of which emerged really the post-war system. I mean, Bretton Woods did not come out of the blue. It came out of these high-level meetings in London and Washington that created, as it were, the framework for the subsequent policies that led to the new architecture for Europe. So it is with that frame of mind that I'm approaching this problem. Frankly, I don't think many people are talking about it. I mean, I don't want to bang my own drums, but I think we are probably the only people, or myself and 1 or 2 others, who are looking at, well, what will this area look like, and how should it look like, and what are the challenges that we have, and how are we going to overcome these challenges? So this pushed towards not looking at the area in terms of the complexities of interstate relations, and they are extremely complex. I mean, it is a multivariate matrix that you have to invert, because each set of relationships in the Middle East, and I'd like to define what I mean by the Middle East. It's basically the Arab countries of Western Asia, excluding the Gulf. So it's the former territories of the Ottoman Empire, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. Possibly we may have to include Kuwait in the planning, but not necessarily in the ideals of economic integration. So looking at it and looking at the crises that we have, the economic crises that exist irrespective of the state of war and conflict, one of the most significant issues that we have is the looming issue of water. There is a very serious water crisis in the Middle East. We all have heard about how the Middle East is water stressed. But in reality, the stress in the past was different from what we face now. What we faced in the past was a kind of misuse of water resources. We had some countries, Iraq, for example, was water surplus. It did not suffer from the conditions that we have now. Now it is really a question of scarcity. There is the flows in the major river basins of the area, and there are a number of perennial rivers there. Obviously, you've heard of the Tigris and Euphrates, but there are other rivers like the Orontes or Nahr al-Asi, Shat al-Arab, which is the congruence of the Tigris and Euphrates and has its own water dynamic. And there are the two smaller rivers in Syria and in Lebanon called Nahr al-Kabir, and in Turkey and in Syria called the Awaiq River. And of course the Jordan River, which is really not more than a small stream. The major waterways are those of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And these have become really critically stressed now. The Euphrates River suffers now from heavy pollution towards its lower reaches and suffers from the cutoff of the water flow as a result of a series of dams constructed by Turkey and also by Syria, which did not take into account the needs of the users downstream. And of course, these countries built these dams and had independent water policies without taking into account the needs of Iraq, because Iraq was either at war or was at sanctions. The Tigris River has another set of problems, and there something like 20% of the flow has been cut off as a result of Iranian damming of the major tributaries that flow into the Tigris. One of the rivers has completely disappeared. And all these issues now are coming to a head. To those on the outside, Iraq might appear to be an oil country. In reality, it's a country of nearly 40 million people, of which possibly 60 to 70% work in agriculture. So it's still very, very dependent on agriculture. And in the last year, as I said, we've had a series of crises that affected the agricultural sector, a cycle of drought and absence of water, increasing salinity. And in the case of Basra, we had a major water crisis because nearly 100,000 people were hospitalized because of the pollution in the water system. Partly because of very, very poor policies, water management policies, partly because of corruption. A lot of the desalination equipment was stolen and not installed. So this is a major problem. What do you do with a population that is rurally based, both in Iraq and in Syria, that has parts of which, or large parts of which, have been displaced as a result of conflict? Where do these people go? What kind of work are they going to have? How are they going to be able to participate in rebuilding and reconstruction if they can't go back to their old habitats because of the absence of the essential ingredients of the rural sector? So, and also equally important is how can you reconstruct the resource economy of the area in order to position it for the challenges that are coming up in the 21st century. So the first thing that we looked at, and when I say we, this is myself and a team of 2 other people, is how can we resurrect or revivify the agricultural sector, both in Iraq and in Syria, in a way that would position the country, not only in terms of increasing agricultural output, but also positioning it in terms of the new economic calculus for the area, post-conflict. So we came up with a proposal that we called the Great Mediterranean Gulf Greenway. Now, this is a multifaceted, multi-sectoral project aimed at revitalizing the economies and societies of the area. Now, this region, as I said, what was known before as the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, they share a common history, language, and religious and cultural heritage. They combine the riverine cultures of the Mesopotamian Valley with the maritime world of the Levant. And often in the past, they were united in the framework of empires. And with the advent of the nation state, obviously, each one of them developed their own political structures and forms. Now, the bands of commerce, trade, and easy population movements that existed before World War I, I think, were weakened tremendously in the past century. And as a result of the establishment of the nation-state system and internal strife, weak institutions, poor governance, environmental degradation, and really unbalanced economies, all of these have led to a crisis condition now. So this idea of the Greenway, we think that it's a transformative idea. It's one that can reorient the economic axis of the region and create the circumstances for its regeneration. The core of it is the construction of a series of waterways that will connect the head of the Gulf at Basra, which is right at the head of the Persian or Arabian Gulf. I prefer to call it the Gulf of Basra, with the Mediterranean coast. Now, we thought of it, first of all, as a navigation canal. If you look at the map of the Middle East, the length between, the shortest point between Basra and the Mediterranean coast is around 1,200 kilometers. Now you say, why would anybody want to build a canal that would cross this terrain? Most of it is desert. If you have the Suez Canal around. Well, the fact of the matter is that if this canal existed, it would cut off something like 1,000 kilometers from the navigation journey from Europe to India. If you're talking about the Far East, the difference would be the same. Also, the economics of canals have changed drastically in the last few years. A ship going through the Suez Canal has to pay something like $250,000 for one-way traffic. Now, I know canals probably in Singapore is not a very nice term because of the Krag Canal, and the major opponent of a project like this, if it ever comes about, would be Egypt. But I think it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that Egypt's loss will be that area's gain. But looking at it as a navigation canal that has in it also the potential of acting as a waterway that can be part of the agricultural revitalization of the area. So the plan is to conceive. The conceptual plan is to conceive of a navigation canal that passes from the head of the Gulf, Basra, goes through the southern Iraqi desert, through the western Syrian desert, and comes out in a gap in between the town of Homs and Quneitra, where the land plateaus, so it's not a very high altitude, into the Mediterranean coast, connecting at a point called Hamidiyya. Now, this might sound like an absurd project, but in reality, this is going back to the future. In 1890, after the construction of the Suez Canal, the Ottoman government sent out a team to investigate the possibility of building a riverine canal that would link the Orontes River, which is called, in Arabic is called the Asi River, with the Euphrates River system as an alternative to the Suez Canal. And it had been costed, and finance was about to be committed to it when the empire decided to build the Hijaz Railway, So it is not a far-fetched scheme. What I'm talking about is not necessarily building a new ditch, but perhaps widening and dredging the Euphrates River up to the Tabqa Dam, which is in the middle of Syria, and then connecting it with a ditch, maybe of half a kilometer wide and 30 meters deep, connecting it with the coast. We talked to geologists, we talked to agricultural experts, and there was some resistance to it, frankly, because of the possibility that if it was a seawater canal, it would affect the aquifers of the area. There are a large number of aquifers in the desert region of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria. And these aquifers, to some extent, have been greatly abused, particularly in Saudi Arabia, because they've been pumped up in order to provide the basis of an agricultural system that is not really, commercially doesn't make sense. I mean, to bring out fossil water, draining the aquifers and using sprinkler systems and paying the farmers something like 2 to 3 times world prices for their wheat, it was a major drain on the Saudi budget. But of course, you have to see it in terms of the system of patronage, because most of these very large farms that have drained the largest aquifer, which Iraq, this one doesn't share with Saudi Arabia, were mainly people who were within or connected to the ruling groups. Now that the aquifers have basically collapsed for this kind of agriculture, they have stopped some subsidy system. But here something has come up which has changed the water politics of the area and has made this plan, actually, that we're talking about more more acceptable. In 2010, a man called Alain Gachet, was a Frenchman. He was a chief geologist for Total, the French oil company. And while mapping out the route of the great man-made river of Gaddafi, I don't know if anybody remembers that, in the 1980s and early 1990s, Muammar al-Gaddafi basically commanded the construction of a major pipeline system that drew on the Kufra aquifer in the Sahara through a 1,200 kilometer network of pipes and bringing water from the Kufra aquifer to the coast. That project, which was denounced as mad and so on, cost about $40 billion. It was obviously spent not immediately, it spent over 10 years. But it provides 70% now of the drinking water of Libya. So it wasn't as mad as people thought. And for some absurd reason, NATO bombed the pumping systems of this great man-made river. So we're not sure whether it's working now or working to small capacity. In any case, Alain Gachet was mapping it, doing aerial surveys of it, and discovered some very important connections between the soil moisture and the presence of what is known as deep groundwater. And in 2010, 2011, the EU financed an aerial survey of the aquifer systems of Iraq and Syria also, because we share a lot of it. And through a series of algorithms, not necessarily by drilling, Alain Gachet discovered that there was a huge sea underneath the Anbar Desert. The Anbar Desert is the desert of western Iraq. And when I'm talking about a sea, it is really a sea. It's twice the size of Belgium. He also, it might sound wild, but he also postulated the existence of a huge underground lake in northern Kenya. And drilling it, the UN discovered that, in fact, there is such a huge underground aquifer. And this is deep water, so you have the established aquifers, and then you have to go down another maybe kilometer to get to the fossil water. Now, if this fossil water is of the size that we believe it is, and I'll find out next month when I go and visit him in France, I hope. And as I said, it is not through drilling, it's through a mathematical modeling that he has made the correlation between the two. Then the idea of a canal, instead of being a seawater canal, could become a freshwater canal. And instead of being a navigation canal, it could be both a navigational canal and a water irrigation and water supply canal. The navigational part of it may have to be de-emphasized, and the water resource side of it becomes extremely significant then. So this is a project, obviously, that can, if it comes about, will recreate both the environmental but also the economic circumstances of the entire region of both southern and western Iraq, which are quite deprived areas. And if it extends into Syria, can also play a very large part in creating a water network, a water system network that could reintegrate the displaced people of Syria, something like 7 million people, back into the economy. So this idea of the Greenway is what I would call the spine of the new thinking regarding the regeneration of the economies of the area. It's like a green corridor, and it will pass through a lot of inhospitable terrain. We have to admit that the southern Iraqi desert and the western desert and parts of the Syrian desert are not really inhabitable. But by creating a kind of access which can draw people in, enormous opportunities open up. The most important opportunity, I think, is the reintroduction of technologically intensive agriculture based on sprinkler systems, based on drip irrigation, which the technologies now exist to make these areas extremely fertile. So part of the Greenway is to attract the technologically sophisticated processes that would be very concerned about water preservation, effectiveness of irrigation, and that will allow for drawing in the displaced community and people who want to re-establish themselves into the agricultural arena, but not under the very inhospitable conditions that existed in the past. And here we come up to another aspect of the Greenway. If it's going to attract people, if the idea is to attract people, then the idea of colonizing the desert comes about. And that brings us to the other aspect of the Greenway, is that this corridor can also have a series of new towns, basically, built on green principles, built on principles of the most environmentally sound processes and system. And the focus, the economic focus of these two nations, and maybe even Lebanon, becomes focused on this project. And one of the most important elements in a kind of economic rejuvenation is to have the national attention focused on one or two significant projects of immense importance if they are developed in the way that they are supposed to. Now, many projects end up being white elephants. But here, I mean, to avoid that, the thing has to be really designed and has to be constructed with the maximum amount of involvement of people. So we hope also that in that process, there will be a kind of democratic engagement of the people in the way in which this axis is going to be constructed. If it turns to be partly a navigation canal, then the idea is to have a spine with networks. So one of the networks would be to have a side canal that would go into the major capital cities. So you'll end up with a side canal that goes to Baghdad, perhaps a side canal that will go into Amman, opening up the interior immediately to international maritime traffic. And it will also draw people together. This network, this water network, cuts across sectarian lines. Southern Iraq is nearly all Shia. Western Iraq is nearly all Sunni. And once you get into Syria, it becomes a mix. And as you get into Lebanon, you're getting into a proper mosaic. So engaging all these people in a major infrastructure project can also be a very important engine for overcoming some of the intractable issues of the area. So back again to the idea of how this axis can work. When fully connected, that's from the head of the Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. As I said, it's a distance of nearly between 12 to 1,400 kilometers. The canal cannot always be flat. It will have to be, at some point, it will have to be elevated through locks. And these locks themselves obviously add to the cost of the canal. However, they have developed now, the Koreans have developed a system which they wanted to employ in the Krag Canal, if it ever gets built. Basically, it is lifting the ships from the waterway onto rail tracks, the entire ship. We're talking about 200,000 tons. I can show you the thing if I can get access to it. So instead of having just locks, you can have a system of multimodal transportation that would lift the ships themselves, move them on rail tracks, and then set them onto the waterway again. The seawater aspect of it could be interesting. I mean, seawater obviously doesn't mix with agriculture. However, there is now a series of pilot schemes that have moved into actually full-scale production of farming based on seawater. The Norwegians have established very, very successful pilot scheme in Qatar and in Jordan, and now they're scaling it up in Tunisia, where seawater drips through a series of panels, creating a vapor system, which is used for hydroponic agriculture, intensive agriculture under greenhouses. And the vision here, if it's possible or if it's necessary to turn it into a seawater canal, is to use the established technology now of dripping seawater on panels, creating the potential of economically effective production under greenhouses, and treating the runoff by separating the salts from the water. The salts themselves in the past used to be dumped, but they have quite a lot of commercial value, not only in terms of sea salt, but in terms of other minerals. And the purified water, the distilled water as a consequence, can also be used to create irrigation systems for parallel open planting. The whole process is being fed by solar energy. So the key here is integrating technologies, integrating various aspects of what appear to be different systems into a kind of holistic process where each one feeds on the other. So thinking down the line, 30, 40 years down the line, not now, you can have the potential of a navigation canal, you have the potential of an agricultural canal, you have the potential of developing quite effective solar-based energy production, and you have the potential of creating a series of new towns built to the most exacting green standards within the framework of maintaining and controlling costs. That would create basically a new axis, a new corridor of peoples and work that would begin to absorb the excess population, which really has no way of finding employment if the oil economy collapses. Everything in the Middle East really depends on the oil price. Now, last month things were very buoyant. Now everybody's depressed again. This kind of cycle where oil is $80 now, it goes down to 60, goes down to 40. There are two forecasts for oil 20 years from now. One is at $250. Another one is at something around $25. Both can be real. I personally veer towards the second. that if the oil market, the substitute market, the alternative energy market, the efficiency market evolves and I think is going to evolve at a faster rate. And if, in particular, the demand for oil products, or oil, not oil products, in the Asian market plateaus as a result of their own initiatives, then we'll have a really a major crisis in the Middle East. And when I talk about the Middle East, I don't mean just the Gulf countries. I mean, some of the Gulf countries have huge cushions of financial wealth. But a lot of the people in the Middle East, directly or indirectly, depend on the Gulf economies through remittances, through work, and so on. So what are the elements, back again, of this just to summarize, of this Greenway? Apart from the navigational central axis. As I said, the seawater can be used as a basis for a horticultural industry, utilizing technologies that use seawater to cool and provide a humid growing climate for vegetables under glass houses. And this is a technology of the Sahara Forestry Project, it's called, which was a Norwegian NGO and has now become a fully fledged company. The runoff seawater can be purified further with desalination technologies and resulting in water suitable for irrigation and byproducts of marketable salts and minerals. The energy to drive the glass houses and even the towns and cities as they evolve will be based on solar power. The purified water will form the basis of extensive open-air farming. And the system will include also, in a very profound way, I hope, the potential of anti-desertification. This is another problem that we have in the Middle East, is that the deserts are growing and expanding. In certain parts of Iraq, deserts are growing at the rate of 2 kilometers a year. So the encroachment is becoming, the forestry cover, which in Iraq really means date palm. The date palm population has dropped from 30 million trees to around 7 million. And it's frequently attacked by all kinds of pests and diseases and so on. But the idea of using the axis to reforestate the area and to stop creeping desertification is a very, very important aspect of it. So you need to have a tree-forest barrier that stops this process. Now, as strategic nodes along this network, you'll have special processing and storage areas will be developed, partly really to utilize the undeveloped resources of the desert regions of Iraq and Syria. We have plenty of phosphates and plenty of gas in the Western Desert and also running into Syria. This has a problem in transportation. The phosphate rock is far away from markets. You need to build a railroad to get the Iraqi phosphate rocks onto the nearest port, which is in Aqaba. And that's going to add billions to the cost. If this network exists, these opening up mining areas can become really an economic enterprise. I'd just like to, I'm sure you all know that, but the opening of the American West, for example, and the settlements in the American West was really driven by the development of the transportation network. So you had the railroads, after which people came, mainly from Eastern Europe, to settle along this line, creating thereby the basis for the modern economy. I talked about the importance of using the network to create a whole series of new towns, and again drawn and based on the most, let's say, the most dynamic, the most cutting edge green policies. So migration then will be an important element, internal migration from the overpopulated cities, by displaced persons, by the rural landless who are increasing in both countries, Iraq and Syria. And it's also a way of rebalancing the population. In time, I hope, again looking 20, 30 years down, that this axis, the Greenway axis, will become a kind of hub for opportunities afforded not only by the construction and development of the network, but also because they'll be using new technologies and processes in the field of alternative power, reversing desertification, water resource management, canal construction and maintenance, and so on. And I hope that this will attract the proper service industries, especially higher institutes of learning, relevant to the development and consolidation of the area. So this is one of the major projects, I think, that around which you can perhaps draw and mobilize large numbers of people. It may not evolve the way that requires. Now we're not even at the conceptual stage. This is a pre-conceptual stage. A lot of it has to be filled up. The main problem is the issue of seepage of seawater into the aquifers. You can say, well, you can do it through lining, but lining adds a cost. Now, I've had it costed, this thing. And it's not really that significant. I mean, it's a huge amount of money, but not significant if you stage it over, say, a 10 or 15-year period. We're talking maybe about $20 to $30 billion. So within the annual budgets of just using an arithmetical model, it's between $2 to $3 billion. It's within the investment horizon of certainly of the Iraqi government. And it can have very important connections to this part of the world, partly through the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative now ends in Gwadar, but the Chinese are sort of hovering around Kuwait now to see how they can be part of it. Of course, Kuwait doesn't need the money, but they need to have a node, a major transportation node at the head of the Gulf. And there are two ways that they're looking at it. One is using the head of the Gulf and passing through Iran into Russia, and from there into the south. The other node, which I think is much more interesting, is the node through Iraq, because you can then connect through the Turkish network right into southeast and southeastern Europe and into Western Europe. So the other element of this Greenway is to perhaps establish a kind of dry canal, which is a rail network that bifurcates. One goes north through paralleling the riverine basin into Turkey and connecting with the Turkish rail system, and the other one paralleling the Greenway itself into Syria and then possibly into Lebanon and Turkey. So it has that aspect to it too. So you have, as part of this vision, let's call it that, is that it will be not only an axis of repopulation, rebalancing, revivifying economies of the south of Iraq and the western part of Syria, but it can also plug into the global transportation networks which are being developed now. I haven't yet. We've discussed it to some extent with major policymakers, let's call them. They haven't yet grasped its significance. I hope to discuss it, to raise it with the World Bank. Now, whether the World Bank itself can act without the support of great powers, I don't know, because this is really what I would call a transformative project. Its purpose is to rebalance the Middle East and to integrate economies and to bring hitherto hostile populations into a kind of mobilized towards a common goal. And again, this is not far-fetched. This is what happened in the TVA. If you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is one of the major projects of the New Deal in America, it basically revived and rejuvenated and energized the entire economy of the American Southeast by harnessing the rivers, creating a hydroelectric system, bringing power to rural areas. It's still, people use that as the main example of how projects of a national nature, when properly executed, can be transformative in every respect. I mean, in Singapore, you've had some of these transformative projects in the early days. So it is not really outside of the realm of the possible. Of course, a lot of the aspects of, especially desalination, requires integrating various systems and processes and technologies, particularly if it's reliant on solar power. So there will be, I think, massive opportunities for all kinds of specialist providers of engineering services, of equipment, and so on, as part of this process. The greening aspect of it, especially the greening of the urban areas. How do you recreate an environment in densely populated areas which would generate all the positive elements of a green urban environment? I mean, these are all things that you know here. You've gone through this process here, and you have developed world-class expertise, I would say. The last aspect of this Greenway, I'm not very happy with it, but I think we have to, for the next 5 years, it will have to be included, and that is to expand the pipeline system, the oil pipeline system, that will link the southern Iraqi oil fields with the Mediterranean market. There is now a project underway to build a pipeline from the southern fields through Najaf, which is somewhere in the middle of the southern part of the country, to Aqaba in Jordan. But for the life of me, I don't see the point of this, because 1 million barrels a day pipeline that starts at the head of the Gulf and ends at one of the inlets of the Red Sea doesn't make sense, unless you want to think of it as a geostrategic diversification. But I think this is something that we have to also consider, because there's a great deal of momentum behind it. So, just in summary, I mean, I might have given you perhaps two. There's a lot here to imbibe and engage with. There are a lot of question marks. There are a lot of uncertainties about this, not least the costings. But just recently, surprisingly, about a few days ago, Iran and Russia announced that they're going to reopen the file on the Caspian Canal. Now, the Caspian Canal is a very interesting proposal, which was made in 2010. And that is to connect a canal between the Caspian Sea and the Gulf, not necessarily at the head of the Gulf, but outside of the Gulf. There are two routes for it. One route goes through the mountain areas of western Iran, and the other route goes through equally difficult terrain, but comes outside of the Gulf. And they had signed a protocol to do that, and very much supported actually by the Indian government. Now it's being revived again. This is primarily to connect the sources of supply of Asia into what's going to be a water network, a navigational network that uses the canal systems of Russia to get to Europe. So that's another idea that's opening up now. But I don't think these, again, are not competitive. Those who are going to be most affected by it, if this ever comes about, is the Suez Canal, obviously. But the Suez Canal, actually, if most of the traffic goes through Suez Canal, goes to East Asia, the navigational journey is not really affected by this alternative route. This will mainly influence the trade routes with the subcontinent. This is really about it. I was talking to the head of ESCWA, which is the Economic and Social Committee for West Asia, about this, and we were supposed to have a meeting next week, but instead he became Foreign Minister of Iraq. So I think that's, at least we have somebody there who is able to. The way I see this evolving is that there will probably be a concept paper with very, very, very preliminary costings that will be aimed at governments and aimed at international agencies. And if that passes the hurdle, then you have to go into detailed master planning. And if it ever comes about, I think we're talking about one of the major infrastructure projects of the world. And the opportunities resources and commercial opportunities that can open up can be immense. Thank you.
Thank you very much.